Welcome to Debut, a fusion of storytelling and play, where we take three amazing and accomplished storytellers and they tell a story for the first time ever. You are the first audience, and we like to get to know the tellers. And if you haven't heard of Debut, hopefully you will soon because you're missing out on all the fun. And part of that fun is introducing the teller. So let me just tell you about the teller that we have in the green room. He was born and raised in Boulder, Colorado. He was raised by granola eating coyotes and grew up without a television. Lacking the traditional American form of child pacification, he found a love for story from records and cassette tapes. He has a BA in theater. He works in the theater as an electrician, and I know he runs lights, and he tells plenty of stories. He has the coveted award of the J.J. Renault Emerging Artist Award. And since the pandemic, he and another person in the Debut family, Rachel Ann Harding, have produced 20 more than 20, I'm sure by now, virtual storytelling shows. That's what I have on paper. But let me tell you about this next teller. This next teller takes the traditional and twists it just a little bit. This next teller, he takes the design of story and breathes through it and has fun with it. Every time he tells, it's something new. He also covets a whole different sense of value for the traditional fairy tale and folk tale, epic and myth, most recently Arthurian legend. It is always a rich pleasure to hear this teller and have more time to talk, and I look forward to bringing him on now, Cooper Braun.
Thank you, Kevin.
Hey, Cooper, how are you?
Good. Busy. We're back in the production of live theater. I work for the Colorado Shakespeare Festival during the summer, and we're back doing live theater, which is a strange and lovely new world.
Also, I imagine busy and dynamic at the same time.
Indeed. I conveniently forgot about those 18 hours that you sometimes spend in the building in one day, which is the part of theater I don't miss.
And you get to see it at the end, and you're like, oh, I can forget those hours, but not during those hours.
I had a moment a couple of weeks ago. We were on our preview night for our first show, and I realized it had been March 11th was the last time I sat in an audience with people watching theater or storytelling, and March 11th of 2020, and I forgot how much I'd missed that. I had that moment of, I've missed this, and I've done a lot of virtual storytelling. I've done a lot of virtual theater, and I've embraced this new strange art form, but I didn't realize how much I missed sitting with an audience. So that's a beautiful thing to be finding again.
So, Cooper, is there room for both?
I think so. I think that what the pandemic proved is that virtual art is not going away. There were people doing live streams. There were people doing YouTube. In the theater world, there was definitely some virtual theater that was starting to be done pre-pandemic. But I think the pandemic really said, this is here to stay. And right now, so Rachel Ann Harding and I, our Stories with Spirit is our production company. And we've produced something over 20 shows now since the pandemic virtually. We've performed in many more. And we have audience members from Singapore who 6 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time show for us, I think, is 9 a.m. for them. And they turn it on and they eat breakfast and they watch the show. We have audience in Canada. We have audience in Australia. We have audience all over the world who we're able to reach. And we're able to do shows like what we're doing right now, right? That we're across the country from each other. And yet we're able to do a show together. And for live theater and live storytelling, you and I will probably perform on the same stage or see each other at a festival or a conference. That happens once a year, maybe twice a year if we're lucky. But here I'm in my little Zoom lair in my basement and you're in your office and we're able to do this. And that, it's great. I absolutely think that they will absolutely coexist.
Excellent. And I know all the reservations at first, but I remember the reservations when there were two people on stage telling at the same time, and they're like, "Oh, they can't do that! What is this tandem thing? Oh my gosh!" It's we just got to make room for the unfamiliar. And
Mm-hmm.
I may be biased, but I think storytelling makes the disconnected the connected when it comes to non-distant learning.
And I think, to me, storytelling is an art form that is uniquely suited to the virtual format. That I do a lot of work in the theater, and in traditional theater we have lighting cues and we have sound cues and we have costumes and we have scenery, and storytelling mostly doesn't have those things, right? That we're not reliant on costuming, we're not reliant on changes in lights, we're not reliant on sound cues, though I've seen storytellers use all of those things both virtually and in person. But we stand in one place most of the time and then we talk, which is very well suited to the virtual form.
Right. And we listen, you know,
Yeah.
because no one performance is the same. And that's different in the theater. We need to look out, even if it's a virtual, we can still not assume, but know that someone's there. I guess that makes sense. And I couldn't say that like a year and a half ago. Know someone's there because with debut, we hear the comments from the YouTube, we hear comments after, a whole bunch of things to help connect the art. Cooper, you've already answered this question, but I'm going to ask it nonetheless. You've started to answer it. What brought you to story, or how did story find you?
So again, I grew up on the art form. I'm culturally illiterate as far as any of my young peers were ever concerned. I didn't have a television. I grew up without cartoons, but my dad really liked story records and cassettes. I My childhood was basically narrated by J.O. Callahan, um, and I
That's a
still
good one
have
to do.
somewhere. It's a two record cassette, or no, sorry, a two record set from the National Storytelling Festival from the early 90s.
I have
And
that.
I grew up listening to storytelling, and then I sort of floated away from that. I began doing theater in high school, and my degree is in theater. And coming back to Colorado, where I was born after high school and college, I started working in the theater, and the university where I work hosts a conference every year called the Conference on World Affairs, wherein they bring in politicians and artists and media. It's about 100 speakers over the course of a week, panels that it's all sorts of interesting people. And the great Irish storyteller Liz Weir was friends with one of the main producers of the conference and began to be brought in. And then Liz began to bring her friends. And I remember working some of Liz's shows and then seeing other ones and saying, oh, right, this is this art form that I remember from my childhood. And I started to go to them, and speaking with Liz after a show, she said, there's a storytelling group here in Boulder. And she handed me a card. And that was the Boulder Story Circle. I joined them in 2013. And then within about 6 months, the woman who was running that story circle returned to Austria, where she had lived beforehand. And she said, Cooper, meet Rachel Ann Harding. You two are now running the story circle. We had met once beforehand. And so we suddenly were running a story circle together, and we became very fast friends. When I started going to that sort of story circle, I realized that from my theater background, I had a lot of the tools in the toolbox already. I knew how to project. I knew how to stand on stage. I knew how to memorize something. I have read folklore and mythology and fairy tales all of my life, so I have a pretty solid background in that. And so I started with maybe a step up, though there's definitely that learning curve of what is the difference between storytelling and theater. That they are sister arts, but they're certainly not the same art. But I definitely started with more tools in my toolbox than some.
Right. They're definitely cousins. Okay, Cooper, I'm going back to that 2 album set. Um, I remember one of the stories on there was a rant on Romeo and Juliet. Would I be
Mhm.
wrong? I just thought it was amazing, and people need to listen to it, where he just pontificates about Romeo and Juliet. Do you remember that?
I do. I do. And so it's funny. This um, perhaps the thing that I'm most overjoyed about in this virtual storytelling world. Rachel Ann Harding and I started doing what we've been calling fairy tale variations, where it's a show, much like Debut, right? It's basically a variety show, effectively, wherein we take one fairy tale, one classic fairy tale. We've done Snow White and Rumpelstiltskin and Hansel and Gretel, and we have 5 storytellers that each tell the story a very different way. And when we got to do The Princess and the Frog, we had pretty much booked. We knew who all of our tellers were going to be. And the great Ed Stivender, who I will be sharing the virtual stage with next week, emailed me and he said, I don't know if you have all of your tellers for Princess and the Frog, but I have this Shakespearean version of The Princess and the Frog. And the light bulb went on behind my head that is a story on that record set that I grew up listening to, that I never connected, that was Ed Stivender, who I've met at conferences. That's Ed. That's one of the first stories Ed ever wrote, and Princess of the Frog is the only show we've had 6 tellers for, because I went to Anna and I said, we have to add another teller. This is like a piece of my childhood that is being offered to me back right now. We have to have Ed.
And here it is coming full circle, because I listened to that album ad nauseum, and I'm like, oh, I can't remember. I couldn't find it. Right. I had no idea it was Ed. That's hilarious, because I was teaching English. And I'm like, I need to play this. And lo and behold, I interviewed him today. I'm interviewing you now. And that's the cool thing about story. We all come together. And I remember when David Novak, first, I believe, went to the Oklahoma tale and said, let's all tell the same tale. It was almost as good as when I was in Tennessee, when each teller was telling each other's stories.
Wow. And we Fairy Tale Variations absolutely owes a debt of gratitude to Oklahoma and Winter Tales, because it was one of those things that I heard people talk about at conferences and at festivals, where people would say, oh, Oklahoma, they would do this thing where all of the tellers would tell one fairy tale, and that kept spinning in Ann and I's heads, that we went, why don't we do that?
I think it's a great compliment. I really do. And I've been privy to hearing some of those tales, and it's just wonderful. And it speaks to, you're in a book that's coming out called Tomorrow Storytellers Today, and talking about the next generation of storytelling and the next movement. Can you speak to, well, first of all, you, like I, grew up with J. O'Callahan. I remember the day he called me on my recording machine. He said, Kevin, this is J. O'Callahan, and I just love what you're doing. And I was like, I saved that forever. And he's become a good friend since then. But the whole thing is, story has changed. And I'm going to hear your answer to this question, and I'm going to tell you what Ed told me earlier, after I hear your response, is how do we keep story changing, but at the same time do what you're doing, honor tradition?
So I think storytelling, as we all know, or those of us in the storytelling bubble, we are a small art. And when I first started telling, and I would tell someone, oh, I'm a storyteller, mostly you'd get that glazed look, and then eventually the classic line, you read books to children? And about 2 years after I started telling, I began to get the question, oh, like the moth? Which then I had a place to work off of. And I know there are many people in the storytelling community who the moth, the upswell of personal narrative storytelling, feels scary. It feels threatening, maybe. And my opinion generally is that it's giving a bigger segment of the populace an introduction to this art form. And I'm able to say, I do tell some moth stories, but what I do is I tell folk and fairy tales curated for adults. And that gives me, if that person is interested, it gives us a place to start to talk about. And that, I think that fundamentally, I think the tent is really big. Sean Buvala is very fond of saying that there's something like, it's like 200 million Americans are on Facebook. If you have 1% of 1% of those people that are interested in doing what you're doing or interested in what you're doing, you have a career made if you can reach those people. And that I think that more than anything, storytellers, our biggest hurdle is reaching audiences. And one of the things that I think the virtual world has let me and my productions do is reach people that I wouldn't normally be able to. And that there are plenty of folks who maybe they've read fantasy novels, maybe they grew up with mythology, reading it. They read folk tales. There's a whole segments of the internet that love folk and fairy tale. Young adult fiction is filled with what is effectively fractured fairy tales. And in those stories, the concept of the storyteller is something that is lauded, and they've never heard a teller.
Right.
And so my thing is, can we reach those people? Because I think most of them, when they hear what we do, they say, oh man, that's amazing. And so I think there is, to actually try to answer the question, I think that the tent is growing. And that I think that especially in the before times, when we felt that there are only so many storytelling festivals, there are only these very few ways to reach an audience, it often felt like tellers were fighting against one another. And especially with the advent of virtual performance, I'm finding it amazing that there are all different shows. There are people doing all different types of things, from Jessica Robinson doing her incredible work, to you with debut, to all of these different things that are all finding audiences that maybe overlap, but the audience is really able to find things that they like. And I think that there's more audience than anybody knows about, and it's really a trick of reaching that. As to the what is traditional, most of my work is not, exactly as the Brothers Grimm's wrote it. I take it and I play with it and I spin it.
Play
And
with it.
I would like to say that, you breathe new life into it.
Yes, definitely. No, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And the whole idea, well, what Ed said is that we need to keep, and just the venture to paraphrase Ed, which is a paradox in itself, we need to keep the root that story is before we start changing. And so I think that we often define who we are as tellers too young. And that doesn't mean
Mm,
that we're 20 or 15 or
right.
5. It means we haven't, well, in my words, word danced enough to
Right.
really say what kind of storyteller we are. I mean, there were, so many people within folk and fairy tradition that searched their whole life to find out who they were as a teller. How do we think that after we tell 4 fairy tales that we're a fairy tale teller, right?
Absolutely. I use the metaphor often when I talk about the moth, that to me the moth is like a sonnet. It's a very strict form. 5 minutes, personal story, on a theme. It's to me a very strict form. And in my metaphor, I just don't terribly like writing sonnets. But writing sonnets is sometimes good for me as a poet, if I'm continuing my metaphor. And that I really come from the perspective that challenging yourself is worth it, right? Reaching out and trying something new. And what does it mean to tell a personal story when most of what I tell is folk and fairy tale? Or what does it mean to try to blend the personal with the fairy tale and sort of a mythic realism story, which is maybe one of my favorite stories I've ever created? And what does it mean to push those boundaries, which is maybe why I'm on your show. And we'll talk about that soon enough, I'm sure.
We're getting there.
To me, there is this. I think there are places we're all comfortable, and sometimes you're really really good at the thing you're comfortable doing, but that doesn't necessarily mean there aren't other ways to play. And sometimes when you play in those other ways, really really fun things come out of that.
And life doesn't happen in the comfortable. It often happens when we interrogate or interrupt or trouble it, which hence is the land of debut,
Mm-hmm.
which comes into, and now you've admitted to me some reservation with play. So let's
Indeed.
talk about what play means to you.
Mhm.
and how you see play in your own work.
Mhm. Um, so for those that aren't sort of on the in joke with Kevin and I, the first conference that I met you at was at the Rocky Mountain Storytelling Conference, and I sat. I came to a workshop that you taught that I'm forgetting the name of, but it was Kevin Cordy trademark storytelling as play. Um, for anybody that knows Kevin, you know what I'm talking about. And I found myself growing intensely uncomfortable in that room. And I chose to sit back and to observe and to be in the room but not participate, because that is what I needed in that moment. And I think fundamentally what it comes down to for me is that so much of my own development process is a very vulnerable place for me. And that vulnerability is something that I am not deeply comfortable exposing to the world. That I work my pieces mostly in my living room, walking up and down and scaring the cats. Though now that my partner is working from home, I mostly go on very long walks. And for the longest time, I would develop my work in my mouth. That I would sort of just start telling it, and I'd back up and I figure out what I like and sort of work the pieces as you go along. I've shifted now more to writing first and then learning off the page. But most of my development happens ever before I step in front of an audience. That I will work it. There are a couple of friends that I have that I will ask, can I read you something? Can I give you sort of a rough draft of something and say what you think? But fundamentally, I feel deeply vulnerable playing with a piece publicly. That I want the piece to coalesce. I want it to have a form before I start to publicize it.
I think that goes to how serious you take story. I think, but, Socrates said that the real work that we do is in play. He said you can tell
Yeah.
in one day of play a man, he said a man, but a man or a woman's life, entire
Right.
life is in that one day. And play is not a rehearsal for life.
Mm-hmm.
It's where we re-see, rethink, re-energize.
Mm-hmm.
And you've already said before, being uncomfortable leads to new direction.
Oh, absolutely.
And so I appreciate that you're on debut, and at the same time that you're not the first to just say I have some reservations. I can think of some people recently, but I can't think of anyone that walked out going, "Oh God, I can't believe I did that."
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's our path, our journey. You really take words seriously.
Thank you.
And they're beautiful things. They're versatile. But when you let them go, you find new words and new directions. And I'm biased, but I like to dance in the rain. But that's not to say that as a director of writing, as an educator, that I don't see those demanding moments when I need to word dance first. I need to go out and yell, hey, Peter Pan should have done this, and then grounding myself to say, I need to seriously think. Right now, I'm working on the Pied Piper Hamlet,
Cool.
Yeah, and I've been reading versions on versions, and I'm thinking, but as I'm working on them, I'm playing with all these ideas out loud to myself. I'm loving the research, but I'm also the three words that I think are most powerful, both in the research, the story making, and storytelling, is what if, I wonder, and imagine.
I like that.
And so I think that in your work, you're doing that too. You just have to. You're.
And I do it in a very different way. I think that I do when I start working on a story. For me, there's a lot of writing prep work that I'm not necessarily writing the story, but I'm going to read version after version. And as stuff comes up, it's to me often, if we're talking about fracturing a fairy tale, which is what I'm doing a lot of lately, this year seems to be the year of fairy tales from the perspective of the male protagonist, first person.
Okay.
I did Hansel and Gretel from the perspective of a very old Hansel. I did Rumpelstiltskin from the perspective of the king. I'm just starting to work on a Beauty and the Beast from the perspective of the Beast. And it's oftentimes when I approach a story, to me, it's finding the thing that trips my brain up. That I say, I have a story that I love called The True Confessions of Prince Charming, which is the story of Cinderella from the prince's perspective. It begins with the words, "Who names their son Charming?" My parents.
I love
That's
it. I
it.
love it.
And that story began of why doesn't the prince recognize her? That why doesn't he? We've spent a long evening dancing together. Why doesn't the prince recognize her when they meet? And that grain of mulling on that bit is what then leads to the story. And so for me, it's often finding that kernel, and then I sit and I write and I figure out and I go through, and depending on the piece, there's a fair amount of research for historical context or names specifically. That if there's a piece set, I have a piece called The Berserker's Daughter, which is written to sound like a Norse saga, though I wrote it, and I spent probably 4 hours researching names, that all of the characters' names have meaning within the story, though that's never explained. And so I do a lot of that, what I think is similar to what you would call play, in my research and my development. And then for me, I have most of what I think I figured it out, worked out before I start writing or before I start working it in my mouth. And then in the working it and in the writing, there's what, I might call a revision process, but a lot of that is, wait, what if? And I'm very big on my goal in any story is, we talk about that idea of story trance, right? Of keeping the audience in the story. And I never want a moment where the audience gets kicked out because either they hiccup on that, why doesn't the prince recognize her? Or I thought we were in fairy tale world and there's a train of, keeping the world consistent and keeping the story consistent. And that's a lot of that revision that I'm going to do during the development of a piece.
So Doug Lippman calls that gem, Catherine Boomer calls it the hidden gem, and Doug Lippman calls it the MIT, the most important thing. And so if I'm hearing you right, and from knowing you, you're never detached from the work that you're doing in discovery. So it's always interpretive, dare I say, play or design or choice. The fun is in the shaping and the making, and to talk about the process and finding deep listening partners and playful partners who are not so evaluative that say, oh, I would do that differently and I would move. There's a time when you're ready, the state of readiness, and you're like, tell me if it's crap,
Right.
But
I think you need those friends though that are going to say that makes no sense.
Yes.
There was a piece that I was working on that I was trying to be maybe a little too clever in breaking up the timeline.
Right.
And two of my good friends were like, wait, what just happened? Did we just jump 12 years? Like, the timeline did not make sense. And
Cooper, those moments happen in play more than any other time available.
Fair enough.
It depends. I mean, I have a different view of play, so we suspend our direction to find new direction. But it's fun. So, saying all this, Cooper, why debut?
Because you asked. Because my friend called me up and said, Cooper, do you want to be on my show?
And I remember Cooper's response was, I have to tell you this. and then explained his reticence, but at the same time he said, but I'll do it for you, Kevin.
Because as we both said, stepping out of our comfort zones is good for us. And I would probably not agree to do this show once a month for the next year. But once, why not?
But we will have you back. We will have you back, Cooper.
Right. Why not?
I mean, we have to again, it comes back to not defining who we are when we're new to the telling. And I still think myself new to the telling. I've been doing it for more than a few years. But I always want to play. I want to be new. And honestly, selfishly, um, storytellers don't they close the door and talk about their process behind the door. I want to
Mhm.
open the door. I want to talk about the process. I want to show the making process. I privilege for years. I privilege telling as the outcome of all performative work.
Mm.
And sometimes, as Richard Bauman says, there's performative work in ordinary speech when it's done differently. And so story has a huge range beyond performance. And that only means the domain of play is even larger than we think.
Mhm.
Cooper, when is debut?
Uh,
The
a week
20.
from Sunday, but this
That's
will not be. We haven't told the audience what day we're on. What
I
is that?
believe the
Sunday the
25th. That's all
Sunday
right.
the 25th.
I will
Uh,
put it up.
12 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time, which
Nice.
I believe is 2 p.m. Eastern Time, which is the published.
That is definitely it's
If
hard
I
to
have learned anything from the pandemic, it's that none of us can do time zone math.
no, not at all. But we're surprised when someone comes in and you're like, you're from New Zealand. All right. I have no idea what time it is, but it is time for story.
Indeed.
Cooper, I so appreciate every time that I get to talk with you. And actually, we're going to tell together on a virtual platform
Indeed.
August 12th, I believe.
Yes.
Jessica, who you mentioned, is another part of the debut family, and you're part of the family now. Um, and we're going to do fairy and folk tales, so it'll be fun. I've
Indeed.
already hinted that Pied Piper will probably creep in,
Right.
and we'll see where we go.
Yeah.
Cooper, it's been great to talk about. I don't want everyone to believe the same way that I believe in play. I just want everybody to be open to the ideas that we're going to shape things together. And I
Mhm.
so appreciate that you're going to be on debut and back again because you'll get the invitation. Um, Cooper Braun, I am giving you the last word.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you for pushing me to step outside my own comfort zone because I talk about that plenty when I talk about storytelling and the work that we do, and I ask other folks to do it. But thank you for asking me to do it, and we'll see what happens. I have no idea what's going to happen in a week. I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you so much for having me on.
Hey, over here, over here. Look over here. This is where debut is. Yes, you can still get tickets. Come on, I'll show you the way.